What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another intriguing podcast episode with me, Ramblings of a Sikh. Join us as we uncover the secrets of the universe. Today, Brian Villmoare, Anthropology Associate Professor from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, dives into the evolution of everything, the patterns and causes of big history. His book explores the intricate dance of evolution across the cosmos, life, and human societies, challenging the notion of history shaped solely by great figures or ideas. Instead, it highlights the gradual interconnected changes across technology, culture, and society. Prepare for an enlightening expedition through the cosmos as we delve into the forces weaving the fabric of existence and our place within it. This episode is a deep dive into the grand narrative of the universe, promising insights that will shift your perspective on history's momentum. Join us on this captivating journey with Brian Villmoare as we navigate the vast history of everything, promising to broaden your horizons and enrich your grasp on the evolution of life and history itself.
Hi, my name is Brian Villmoare. I am an associate professor of anthropology in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And we're here to talk about this book, The Evolution of Everything, the Patterns and Causes of Big History, right here. And I'm here to answer questions.
I guess the first question would be, for those listening, if you were to give a short overview of the book, what would you say? Like, as in a couple of sentences, if you were to summarize it, what would your answer be?
So the book starts at the most general with the Big Bang, and then starts narrowing down. So in other words, we talk about the Big Bang, then we talk about the solar system, then we talk about the planet, and as it works its way towards us as the main topic. So the second half of the book is actually moving beyond even the biology, just to talk about some patterns in history and how the trajectory of human existence has gone. What are the things that have remained unchanged, and what are the things that have changed? And then, works its way into the very specific toward the end of the book.
What led to you then writing this book? Like, what was kind of the culmination or the inspiration behind putting this together?
So, I just, having taught introductory level anthropology for, I don't know, something like 10 years, I realized just talking to the undergraduates that they didn't really have the perspective of connection. They didn't know how geology informed biology or history, or how biology informed, human behavioral patterns, right? So they didn't know the connections of all of those things. And they are connected, right? Because things have to happen first. You have to have a planet before you have life. You have to have life before you have complex organisms, and so on. And they just weren't aware of the connections of all of those things. And so I proposed this class called The Evolution of Everything. And I think I called it initially something like Deep History or something like that. And when I taught the class, actually, I had to defend the class in front of the history department because I had the word history in the title, and they were protective of the idea of history. So I had to go in and give like an hour-long presentation to the history department. And they could see I wasn't doing traditional academic history. I wasn't talking about Abraham Lincoln or something like that. I was speaking more broadly. So they were like, okay, you can do it. So I taught the class for a few years, and after a while, the students said, they kept saying, how come there's no textbook for this class? And there are some books that cover some of the material, but not in the way that I thought was helpful to them. So ultimately, I just pitched the book to Cambridge, and they were like, oh, yeah, okay, sure. So, that was kind of it. It was based on what the students wanted, really.
The book, and also you mentioned just earlier on that it's not traditional in its historical approach, and it's interdisciplinary in terms of you're going from, as you said, from biology to geology and how one influences the other. Now, how does viewing history through these multiple disciplines provide a more kind of comprehensive understanding then of the past, but then also of our present?
Well, just to give you some examples, humans have been invading and capturing each other. Basically, chimpanzees do something fairly similar. So this is probably a fairly universal human behavior. And I feel like when we talk about human conflict, it's easy to get bogged down in the specifics. why did Russia invade Ukraine or whatever, But if you take that as one case of a pattern that has gone throughout history, that might allow you to figure out the conditions that might constrain someone from invading, right? So I tend to take a somewhat biologically determinist perspective, and I feel like humans throughout history, I mean, I'm not aware that there was ever a society when it became strong just said, oh, we'll just be nice to everybody. As soon as societies get strong, anywhere in the world throughout the last 10,000 years, they said, oh, we're strong enough. You have something we want, a port or a crop or whatever, or oil. We kind of feel like we should take it now. And so, but there are conditions under which that can't happen. So you may want to say, okay, when we look back at history, we see it's universal. How has it been prevented in the past? What can we do now to impose constraints on the ability of a country to do that? And that can be internal or external. So an internal constraint might be democracy. There's this kind of trope in international relations that democracies tend not to invade other democracies. And the idea largely being that if you acknowledge the people in your own society as having rights to vote or whatever, civil rights, then you might extend that out. You might generalize that to other countries. And so it's not that it would never happen, but it just reduces the tendency. Whereas fascist countries, it's part of the model of a country is we are stronger and different, and therefore that justifies our invasion. So you have some seeing patterns, like, so that might be a constraint. Another constraint might be external. Maybe you make an alliance, that inhibits, invaders. So for example, Russia right now, they didn't want Sweden to join NATO because that is an alliance that is going to inhibit their ability to move in that sort of space, So there are different things that you can do, and you might acquire that knowledge by stepping back hundreds or thousands of years to sort of figure out, under what conditions it happens and when conditions it doesn't, and under what conditions it doesn't.
Which kind of leads me on nicely to the next question, which is, as you've been talking, and the book itself places an emphasis on kind of science and the need to use it to understand the past. Now, how can these scientific disciplines shed light on historical events such as, say, World War II or anything else for that matter?
Well, when history wants to explain a pattern, wants to explain why something happened, like causality, right? They will typically they will say X happened, then Y happened, then Z happened, right? And so it's very specific. And in the scientific term, it sounds like they're trivializing it, but not necessarily. It's anecdotal. It's like, oh, okay, this happened, then that happened, that happened. So a more scientific question might be, when we see this type of event happen, do we see a correlation with another type of event later on? And therefore we can test the idea of causality. So for example, with fascist countries, you might say, once you become a fascist country, how often are you likely to invade someone? And so that might be a statistical question. You might, because there have been lots of, well, not even the word fascist, maybe authoritarian. Like, are authoritarian countries statistically more likely to invade than non-authoritarian countries? You might be able to approach it, using fairly simple statistics, right? And that kind of a correlation would tell you something, right? At least it's a testable hypothesis. Whereas if you present it as an anecdote, you just say, oh, this one guy did this one thing, and then this other thing happened. How do you assess that to see if it's really true or not? It just becomes kind of like an argument or like, some sort of like anecdotal evidence marshaled in favor of one idea or the other. And so science, can help you address those by treating things as classes of events, I would say.
So what would be, I guess, then some examples of how other disciplines help and understand historical events?
Well, because I'm an evolutionary biologist. So, for example, sorry, my phone's ringing. I apologize. Yeah. So, for example, violence across societies, right? If you can actually go to Wikipedia or the United Nations, and you can compare statistics on violence by males versus violence by females, right? There's not a single country that in which the women are more violent than men, right? I mean, that is like biology is driving the pattern, right? And you can, I can easily find you because I use this image in my slides sometimes. You can easily find an image of that, and it is stark. Women do something like, I don't know, 5 to 10% of the violence that men do, right? So that is going to be, and then you might say, okay, when we're trying to decide who we want to be the president or prime minister or something, that might inform on how you make that decision, because you know that statistically speaking, men have a greater tendency toward violence and women have less. And if you are trying to maintain peace with your neighbors, that might bear on your decision making.
Interesting. It's really like, as in, because I come from obviously very traditional historical understanding. So then to go through your book and then to kind of understand it in this way was really interesting. On one hand, you would have like narrative history, and then on this side, you would almost say it's like scientific perspective to a degree. How do you think, I guess, they can be balanced, or is kind of one almost a microcosm of the other in terms of like narrative history is still included in the scientific perspective, but it's just a lot more of them. So as you were saying, it's like classes of history rather than just one particular narrative.
Right. So like in evolutionary biology, for example, we do need to use narrative. So I study human evolution, and we talk about Australopithecus evolving into, early Homo or, other whatever species. That's a narrative, right? It's just that at any moment along that, when you invoke any kind of causal relationship, you have to be able to test that relationship. So you can't just say X happened, then Y happened. You have to say, okay, or for in my case, so I studied this particular time period when the genus Homo first evolved. So it's sometime between 2.5 and 3 million years ago. And people have invoked this causal relationship. They say, well, climate changed. Australopithecus was kind of ape-like with long arms, and then Homo is like us with long legs. Climate must have changed. And so the question is, can you test that hypothesis? And the way we test it is we go out and look at all the non-human animals, and we try to determine if they are forest animals or sort of grassland animals, right? And if it's more grassland animals, now, at let's say 2.8, but then at 3.2, it was a lot of forest animals. Then you have actually tested the hypothesis of climate change being associated with the disappearance of the ape genus Australopithecus and the appearance of the more, human-like genus Homo. But you've done it with using science at that moment. When you say there's this causal change, that's a narrative description. X happened, then Y happened, then Z. But you plug in some, testable hypotheses, and therefore it gives us more confidence that the narrative is likely to be correct.
So it's more of a focus on the causality and proving that, rather than just being like, well, X, because I say X happened, then Y must have been the result.
Yeah,
of it.
exactly. Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. And
Okay.
Causality is a tricky thing philosophically. I don't know if you study all that. It's very hard to get at causality. And what science just does is it looks for correlation. If the majority of time you see either extinction or evolutionary change, it's driven by climate change, then when you then later on see some sort of evolutionary change, you say, well, most of the time it's caused by climate. We should probably go look to see if climate is changing and causing things to get hairier or, less hairy or whatever, whatever you are adapting to temperature or something like that, right? So it gives you a framework in which you can then go out and test the hypothesis, but you don't just kind of wing it. You wouldn't just say something happened, then something else happened, because, yeah, right. I mean, then someone else will come along and just say, oh, no, the reason was this. And if there's no standard for comparing the two, then where are you? Then it's just a question of sort of who writes better or something like that, or who's more persuasive in some sort of rhetorical way, which scientists try to get away from. You don't want to just have it so that someone is, essentially a better lawyer,
No, I like that. Just coming back to what you were saying about causality and scientists going for correlation more so than causality, like as in you were talking about the philosophy of it. I'd love just to get your kind of thoughts on that. Like, so I guess what I inferred from that is that it's very hard to prove causality, or causality is just difficult, full stop.
Yeah,
I
so I
would
mean,
love
it's
just,
like a
yeah.
famous philosophical problem, right? David Hume essentially said it's almost impossible to ever prove causality. All you can do is kind of look for patterns. And um, Karl Popper was this early 20th century philosopher of science, and he said, yeah, you're right. You can't really prove it, but you can sort of test it. So let's say the climate change thing. If someone said, oh yeah, climate change drove the change in humans or whatever, you can't prove it, but you can test the idea to see if it's not true. So in other words, if you saw no change in the other animals, like let's say forest animals all the way through, no, not a single variation, then you will have taken the hypothesis of climate change and rejected it, right? And so in science, we say, okay, provisionally we accept the hypothesis, and then it gets tested again and again, and the more it gets tested, the more we say it's okay. We find that persuasive. But it is like one of the tenets of science is that no matter how well-tested a hypothesis is, someday someone could come along and falsify it. Like there's no such thing as true knowledge in science. You just have to accept everything is provisional, and we're okay with that. But and if a hypothesis is so good, and it might become, what they call a theory, and a theory is kind of this body of knowledge that's been repeatedly tested and never rejected. So like the theory of relativity, theory of evolution, gravitational theory, those are theories, but if you jump off a building, you will definitely fall, right? That is another way to test gravity, and it works every time.
In your book, and this kind of just correlates to what we're talking about causality. Like you talk about proximate and ultimate causes, and I would just like to ask you, like, why is it essential to distinguish between them when analyzing historical events?
I would say for a similar reason to what we were talking about earlier about understanding history as like just studying the most recent history versus understanding the broader pattern. If you get in my opinion, if you bog down into historical details, you will be looking for one personality who changed history or something like that, right? Like you will invoke that. And the classic example is like, would you go back in time and kill Hitler or whatever? Like this is kind of that thing, right? But the broader question is, if you have authoritarian governments that are technologically superior, I mean, would they have invaded anyway? If you understand that humans are always trying to get something or take something, well, males, I would say mostly, that this is a universal pattern, whether you're talking about Alexander the Great or Genghis Khan or the Nazis, as soon as you have sort of authoritarian power within a government and then also a lot of technological power relative to other countries, you're just going to do it. It's just going to happen. And so the broader cause would be the instinct to invade, even though the proximate cause would be Hitler was a persuasive, evil guy.
I guess one thing that I inferred from what you were saying, though, is there's almost like violence is innate biologically to males, at least. And that is what is driving 90% of historical narrative in terms of it's like these great individuals who are, like, so to speak, like big characters who have gone and changed the historical record. And you're actually saying, well, the whole thing can be summarized by the biology of humans.
I mean, that is my perspective. And so the way you might apply that in the historical record is to say, I mean, there are certain times clearly when in a population of 20, 30, 50, 100 million, whatever, certain individuals are particularly charismatic. And that's probably, someone is going to probably rise to the top. It might not matter necessarily if it's Hitler or one person who's equally smart and evil as Hitler. I mean, but there may be times when they do act as catalysts, and it either operates faster or in some other way. I'm sure they do cause change, But whether they're driving the thing, I mean, people have talked about this as like one of these, tropes. You're like, well, should you kill Hitler? And some people say, well, if you kill Hitler, the Nazis still rise up. And instead of having a madman, they have someone who's much more of a linear thinker, and probably they don't lose because they don't invade Stalingrad. Like it's, you know what I mean? Like the circumstances may arise anyway. And that is a statistical question. You could go out and look at that. But if you look at authoritarian governments, they do tend to be run by single people who are charismatic. Like that is a universal pattern, whether it's, the Perones in Argentina, or, Mussolini or Hitler or Genghis Khan or Alexander the Great or whomever. Like these are all charismatic people who sort of rise up out. And that's a repeated pattern. The question is whether you treat it as, each one of those is like a great man who's changed history, which is sort of like Carlyle's sort of great man theory. He said all of history is a footnote to the great men, right? And I would say he's got it 180 degrees wrong, that, there is a universal pattern. And if you have these types of circumstances, a person will always rise. And so that you're just following a pattern of, repeated whatever. And so the question is, can you constrain them in some way? One of the interesting things that I've observed just over the last year and a half is if you look at the way Europe handled Hitler by appeasing him pretty much, giving him Czechoslovakia and whatever, and you compare it to Ukraine, where the West was like, we've seen this kind of thing before. Putin's an authoritarian, and the way to really handle it is just to stop him in his tracks as best you can without creating World War III. And so they really haven't rolled over, at least, not so far, and he's been stopped. And other countries like Sweden have decided to join NATO, which they had not before, because they suddenly realized this may disincentivize this kind of authoritarian behavior. That's just, and I'm just speaking off the cuff, of course, but that's kind of the model, I would say, taking a scientific approach to it.
Just while you were talking, one of the questions that came to mind then was like, you've explained, I guess, these great men theory, but then you've got, and this is just more so because I saw, obviously, with last month it being however many years, I can't remember now, 22 years since 9/11. There was a newsreel that I'd seen on YouTube, and like my question then to you is like, from your perspective, from like a biological determinist perspective, how do things like that fit in? Because surely it's completely against human nature, biology to kill yourself, is the assumption, right?
Yeah, right.
But then equally at the same time, whilst we were talking, I was like, well, surely it's just the fact that in their minds, they think they are a great man. So it still comes back to the great men theory. So I don't know.
Yeah.
But I would just love to get your opinion on that.
Well, so, human psychology is complex, right? So obviously, if you take a super simplistic model, you will be wrong some of the time, because all kinds of crazy things that people think or do, but there is an interesting study. So they do this study where they put a monkey in a cage, and if the monkey pressed the lever, it got a piece of cucumber, right? And that monkey was happy, right? Then they brought another cage in with the same species of macaque, and they taught it to push a lever. But when it pushed the lever, it got a grape, right? So there was a divider between them. When they pulled the divider out, the monkey that was getting the cucumber saw that the grape-eating monkey was getting grapes. And at that point, that monkey refused to push the lever for the cucumber. Now, it's getting nothing now, right? But it didn't care. It was just so angry that the other monkey was getting the grape that it would rather go hungry than perform the rational act. So there clearly is something in there, about rationality, and in a social environment, when you see something else doing well, it would be worth it to suffer in order to not somehow feel inferior to the other primate. And so I suspect something like that is probably going on. In an intuitive sense, I get that, So I would say it's probably something like that. Like, it wasn't rational to kill themselves, but they felt like they were being devalued in some important way. And it's whatever, the West versus Islam or whatever you want to call it. Like, there was this sense that we're not being treated right, and they would rather die or suffer in some way than accept that condition. They would rather make a blow against that. And so I suspect there's something in human psychology that's we inherited from our primates. We were social animals, and so social animals have particularly complex brains because you are constantly assessing all the relationships and the dynamics of all these other animals. It's one of the reasons we have big brains, really, is that we're social.
There's just so much that I want to guys, and I'm almost could just sit here and let you continue to talk because there's so much that's just wanting me to then ask off the back of that.
Please do. Yeah.
From the social angle, then equally, 9/11 is also attack completely on that social, just society, full stop, because it is such a public.
Right. It was a statement. I mean, it was a very visible statement about we can get to you and hurt you in a fairly symbolic way, because it wasn't like it was going to change the American economy or disrupt our military in some way. It was just a symbolic thing, but in a way, that's what the cucumber eating monkey is doing, right? It's symbolically saying, I'm making a statement. I am rejecting the system that you have put in front of me. I do not accept it.
Just staying with the book for the time being, you delve into the definition and characteristics of science, and I guess my question off the back of that is, how does the scientific method ensure objectivity, and why is it crucial for understanding our universe?
Well, it doesn't ensure objectivity at all, right? It's the main thing about science is that, there are a couple things. One is that you can't make a statement that in which the information is not accessible to everybody else. So you can't say, I have a secret knowledge, right? So, in the Catholic Church, the Pope can speak ex cathedra. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but it essentially means, by definition, his statement is infallible. And you don't hear the Pope making that statement very often, and it's usually not about who's going to win the World Series, or something like that. It's, it's about matters of doctrine, right? So what he's saying is, I know what God thinks, and therefore you cannot question what I am saying, right? And that is not uncharacteristic of religious orders in which one person has sacred knowledge, other people don't. Science doesn't have any of that, right? So there is no such thing as sacred knowledge. So, and all the time, students will see something that a professor did and say, I'm going to go re-examine your data and see if you're right and prove them wrong. It happens all the time. It's one of the best ways for a student to get their name out is to publish a paper that totally contradicts what Mr. Big said, and science says that's fine. Science says we're not going to reject that. Now, the individual scientist may be grumpy about it, and that often happens, right? There are famous instances of that even in my own discipline where someone challenged a famous professor, and the professor's like, rah, rah, rah. But the entire discipline accepted, right? Because the hypothesis that had been presented was found to be false, right? And so this idea of not having any information that you can't challenge means that, and having people challenge information all the time means that for any idea, another idea comes along and they test each other, right? And so the idea is you're kind of narrowing, you're getting closer and closer to accuracy with that. Every time someone checks your work, if it's correct, and the check doesn't prove you to be wrong, then that idea gets a little bit stronger, but it's still someone else can come along. So the idea is you're kind of refining your knowledge all the time, and it's constantly self-correcting, which is not the way any other body of knowledge works. There's no other body of knowledge in which people are constantly self-correcting and all the information is open and explicit. And so that's an extremely powerful way to think about things. And there have been times in history where people have tried it, and then they have been repressed because they weren't in a society that would accept that. Like the Islamic Golden Age, had some really, they really advanced technology enormously, and math and, biology and all these things. And of course, in there were people who were challenging the idea of, the monotheistic God. And those people, they were repressed, and so it has been prevented in the past, even though the idea of it seems intuitive. But, I mean, you'd have heard of, Socrates was essentially executed because he did the same thing. He challenged the local gods. And so, Athens was like, no, you can say a lot of things, but you can't challenge the very foundations of our knowledge base, and we're going to have you drink hemlock, supposedly, is how he died. So, but now in the modern world, we have sort of accepted this idea. Most of the world has accepted the idea that there is this thing called science, and it's acceptable to keep challenging ideas. And so that's the power of it.
You gave a few examples, and it's clear that throughout history, scientific discoveries have always often clashed with religious or social beliefs. How do you think those tensions have shaped our understanding of the world? And do you think that will always be the way? Because I guess if you've got institutions like the Catholic Church and other religious places being able to kind of discuss the sacred, that is completely almost the opposite to the scientific approach.
No, it is. I mean, the Catholic Church actually nowadays, they have backed off that entirely. And by the time Darwin even came out with evolution, they didn't even, sure, they famously sort of repressed Galileo, but by the time of the 19th century, the Catholic Church had sort of come around and realized that was not a winning argument, because you're not going to persuade people by just saying, oh, you can't even read the book, And so they try to sort of say, oh, yes, evolution occurs, but it's a manifestation of God's will. It's kind of a fuzzy, like they're not going to take a stand at any one point. Now, that's not the case for a lot of churches. The United States is famous for its creationists, right? And so they lock horns all the time. And I personally do it. So there's a YouTube video of me mixing it up actually with a Vedic creationist who came to UNLV. People come to my door. I keep a Bible by the front door with sticky notes in it so we can flip open to passages to see, if they think that these things are true, because I think it's important to engage against that, right? I mean, to force people to defend their positions, and most of the time it's fine. I've never had anyone take a punch at me or something like that. Usually they come to your house, they're trying to persuade you, and I don't, I think it's fine that they do it. I actually think it's good to have those debates aired out. But I would say, as long as no one's using violence or actual repression, I think it's important to have those things expressed, because most people, in my experience, I do this thing in the class where I have the students put their heads on their desks and I say, raise your hand if you think of yourself as religious. And maybe 60% of the class raises their hands, right? They're religious, right? UNLV, we're in Nevada, it's not a particularly religious state. If you're in the American South, it would probably be like 90-something%. But then I say, okay, how many of you, keep your heads down, of those who are religious, how many of you have a different religion from your parents? And usually 1 or 0 people will raise their hand, because most people just have the religion of their parents, right? The implication of that is that they didn't get to their religion by thinking about it. Like, in other words, you don't start from 0 and say, I'm going to choose religion today, right? You just grow up in a faith and that carries you on, right? So people really haven't thought about why they are Catholic or Protestant or Hindu or anything. It's just sort of baked into who they are, what their parents did, raising them, and all those kinds of things, right? So by putting these debates out in public, or making them in public, it does force people to think about why they believe what they believe, which most people don't ever do. You just sort of, you show up, you go to church, and then you go home and you say, oh, the preacher gave a nice sermon today or whatever. And then you don't think about it, right? And so by airing these debates out, I think it's useful just forcing people to consider, why they feel the way they do. And most people don't really have a reason that we would think of as like they didn't reason their way into it. The only downside is every once in a while, there are some places where you can't do that, obviously, right? Because it's physical danger, and it's not. I mean, there are places in the Middle East where you probably couldn't. You can't just stand on a street corner in Saudi Arabia and advocate for Pentecostalism or something like that, right? That you would be arrested, right, or deported, or optimally just, told to leave. And in the American South, you might just get into a fist fight. You know, I mean, there was a job when I took this job in Nevada, that there was a job in Mississippi, and my wife was like, "You are not permitted to apply for that job," because she knows I'm an arguer and I like to be public about these kinds of things.
Oh, I see.
And she knew I was gonna, and she was like, "No, they're gonna shoot you." She grew up in the South, and she's familiar with it. And she was like, "You understand? Like, you have to wear bulletproof vest all the time." And I was like, "No, it would be good. Like, it's a chance to sort of access these people." And she was like, "Yeah, for like the first hour until you're dead," and then that was that. So I didn't take the job in Mississippi.
Oh, I'm glad, because we might not be having this conversation if you did. So,
right.
Yeah.
Right. So anyway, but I do think it is important to try to get people to think about why they believe what they believe, and in my class when I teach this, we discuss those things, like how, like I try to get, like, how many of them actually have read the Bible, right? Because this is in the United States, mostly Christians, like, how many of you read the Bible? And the answer is 0. Like, they don't know what's in the book even, right? So, and actually I always have a question: what's the first commandment? Can you even tell me the first commandment? No one knows the first commandment. They just don't even know it. Like, so they think of themselves as Christian because they go to church, but there's no consideration of what the implications of that are, or the rules are, or how it's written. No one's read Leviticus or something, crazy like that, where all the really wild laws are, you shall not eat crickets, like there are these really wild laws in Leviticus. So anyway, yeah, that's why I do this, is to try to get people to think about this. And that's why I wrote the book in that perspective.
The book mentions the importance of picking an appropriate scale of analysis. And I guess the traditional historian in me is almost being like, well, surely you're just taking a really macro view of history rather than kind of the micro view of this particular event is happening because of X and Y, Z reasons on a far smaller scale. Like, how does the scale of analysis impact then our understanding of historical and scientific events? And I guess a question off the back of that is then, why take such a wide view of things? Like, as in, I really enjoyed the perspective because it's something I would never have considered, but like, why such a wide view of history almost?
Well, for me, because if you're going to be doing it in a scientific way, you simply need like a large sample size. Like, if you're going to talk about why someone invaded a country, and from my perspective, you say, well, that's another case of a country gets a powerful leader and some sort of advantage in demography or technology and invades. But that means you have to step out and say, okay, let's look at all the instances of that, count them all up, compare them, like you're obliged to do that. So not that you wouldn't necessarily talk about one case, but you would still treat that as an example of a type of circumstance, right, that happened. So you would say, okay, we'll take that. That's important, right? We want to look at Nazi Germany, but we also want to say, is that a case of totalitarian or authoritarian governments or something like that? So you would maybe move back and forth, but in my view, to understand it, like from a scientific perspective, you have to also take that step back to understand it. And scientists love big sample sizes. Like, we're always like, we need to get our sample sizes up, because when you do stats or something like that, the more numbers you have, the more precision you have in your assessments.
The book, and this is a question that I was quite interested to ask you about, which is that the book touches on the idea that humans in the earth might just be a complete random product of just completely random forces. How do you think that perspective then challenges traditional beliefs about purpose and destiny? Because I guess on one hand, people could say, well, if it's completely random, there can't be any divine will, so to speak, behind it. But then equally, you could say that randomness is itself what those people consider to be divine.
Yeah, so the second one you said is the Catholic Church's position, essentially, right? That we see the manifestation of God's will through this random process, and look, we showed up anyway, right? But there's a whole philosophy of this, right, where people say, we happen to be the ones that made it, right? And we're writing the history. Therefore, it seems like we are the purpose, or like part of this, like we are in a sense part of the end process of, at the end of this process, right? But let's say humans didn't evolve and Neanderthals were the ones that evolved. They would be saying the same thing. Like, in other words, whoever is the one writing the story, let's say the KT extinction. The KT extinction is when the meteor hit and wiped out the dinosaurs 65 million years ago, right? Now, those were all reptiles, and some of them were quite smart. So, like, velociraptors from the movie, they, from Jurassic Park, they say how smart they are. They were smart, right? And they actually had some of the features that we associate with intelligence. So, first of all, they had hands to manipulate the earth, right? And or the environment. Also, they were social. And they do have larger brains than predicted by looking at other dinosaurs, right? They were pretty smart. Excuse me. Sorry, I apologize for this.
No, that's fine.
So who knows? In 20 million years, maybe brain selection makes them big enough so they're writing the history. And they're like, yes, well, velociraptors were part of God's plan. It's like just like whoever wins, like to assess the likelihood of that is essentially impossible, So, but I always tell my students, I'm like, how many of you have like you've heard the story about how your parents met? Like, someone got on the subway and dropped her book, and the guy picked it up, and they met and they fell in love. And it easily couldn't have happened because she didn't drop the book, or he didn't look that way, or whatever. So your being here is random, right? I mean, as an individual, your being here is random because everyone's grandparents, like, who knows? You weren't at the same library, or going to the shop at the same moment. Any number of circumstances, and most people are okay with that. They say, yeah, my being here is essentially random. And parents all the time are like, we weren't trying. The birth control didn't work. So, it was an accident. I was that way, right? My parents are always like, we don't know what happened. Your mother was just clumsy with birth control, or, whatever. So in that sense, that it's not even intentional to have any baby, right? Let alone me as a specific product. And most people are comfortable with that. But when you extend that out to the presence of our species, that the species itself needn't have been here. What if the climate hadn't changed in East Africa between 7 and 5 million years ago? Humans wouldn't exist because apes had existed for 20 million years totally happily, right? And it was only the climate change that created the circumstances where some group of apes were able to adapt to a more open environment, right? And that was bipedalism with Australopithecus, right? But that's if the climate hadn't changed, or there hadn't been that group of apes in that place at that time, boop, humans don't exist. And then we're not having this conversation. So, but when you say that to people, I had an uncle who was, religious, and he believed in evolution and everything, and he was very sciencey. And then I said, yeah, but this means that humans are a product of randomness, and we needn't exist. And he was sufficiently religious. He's like, yeah, I can't get with that. And I mean, it was like totally inconsistent, right? Like, there is no internal logical consistency there. And he kind of acknowledged it. He was just like, yeah, I'm not going there. Forget it.
Yeah,
and
I'll ignore that. I'll ignore that.
Right, exactly. So for most scientists, I think we just say, yeah, we're random, and let's just move on. It's not like a thing that we fixate on. It's only if you are a philosopher that you have to worry about that.
Yes.
And scientists actually are not very philosophical. Like, I was a philosophy major as an undergrad, so I enjoy the debate about all that. But most scientists are like, get out of my way. I got to do more pipetting in my lab. Like, they're like, they're like construction work, or like whatever. You're like,
more titrations.
Yeah, that's right. We got stuff to do. Get out of our way. Don't get us this philosophy. This is the stupidest thing I ever heard.
Surely, when it comes to the conversations between people who are religious, and obviously in America it's predominantly Christians, surely it's just a conversation between belief and fact, or evidence, however you want to define the scientific perspective. Because surely it's just a belief, like, well, actually, like, so for argument's sake, I went to a Church of England school, so I had a lot of the
we had a lot of these debates in our religious education classes, and so surely it's just a matter of, because and in one of the textbooks in our class, it was like, I can't remember, it was basically like, well, I could believe a spaghetti monster is God. Like, that doesn't make it true. And so surely it's just like that in a nutshell.
Well, so the thing about religion is that it's not, it's so fundamental to people. It's like their identity culturally, but also their worldview. And most people, if you drill into them too much, they just disengage. It's like a psychological thing. If you present someone with this information that is like, I mean, there are all kinds of things about religion that I think are unanswerable. So, like morality, in the Christian faith, morality plays a central role, and God is benevolent and all-powerful, right? And so there's this wasp called Ampulex, and it lays an egg inside a beetle, kind of like Alien in the movie, right? It does exactly what Alien does. It lays an egg in, and it paralyzes the beetle. And the beetle's alive, and it's being eaten out from the inside for like a month, right? And you can bet that is unpleasant, right, for that beetle. And Darwin famously saw those wasps and said, yeah, those wasps, like he said, that's inconsistent with a benevolent God. That a benevolent God who was also omnipotent wouldn't permit that suffering, because it doesn't happen for any, like, no one's learning a lesson, or it's not helping, like, it doesn't, there's, people sometimes say, well, there's no questioning God's plan, like somehow the suffering does something. But he said, no, there's no possibility, because no one even knows that suffering occurs. Most people don't know, and they don't do anything about it if they do know. So it's just suffering for suffering's sake. And he said that is inconsistent, right? And there are a lot of questions like that. And if they're unanswerable, essentially. And that's why I'm not religious, because one of the reasons I'm not religious is that I don't think you can square that circle. Like, it is not possible to make that work. So, so there are some conflicts like that surround religion. And if you push people too hard on those, and then what you're doing is you are asking them to not just think about why they think about some abstract religious belief. It also says, my religious leader is wrong. My family is wrong. My culture is therefore worth less, because there are other cultures that don't think this. And that is, psychologically, is too much. So I mean, my experience is you can't really do that. And I don't, like, if you, and it's like if you, and this happens in my family sometimes, someone will ask me, say, you know what? So, okay, we're alive for 100 years at the most. What's the purpose of all this? And you say, science doesn't do purposes. Like, all we do is describe the material world, and I can't tell you purpose. And students ask me this sometimes too. At the end of the semester, once they've been through the class and they've thought about all this, yeah, a lot of times students do say, so what is the purpose of all this now? And I'm just like, you won't get it, right? You have to make up your own purpose. Your purpose is to make others lead a happier life, or help the world, or whatever, or like in the case of most scientists, the purpose of life is so that when you die, you have sort of advanced the ball down the field a little bit. Like, the human knowledge, right, is moving forward a little bit. For me, the purpose, like I always tell my kids, right, they're not religious, and they are, but we do a lot of volunteer work, and I always say, look, just leave the world better than you found it. Like, all you can do is try to, and move something in this direction. And I do feel like I am very much a believer in the principles of the Enlightenment. That I do think the world was very cyclical, and just conqueror after conqueror after conqueror. But at some point, the world said, yeah, we're not moving. Nothing is getting better for the majority of the world until we adopt these principles of universal human rights. And I would say, like, there is evidence that the world is a better place than it was 300 years ago. I mean, certainly 300 years ago in the West anyway, women had no property rights and they had no political authority. And the life expectancy was 45 years old. And slavery was legal in the majority of the world, right? And so there has been, in my opinion, progress. Is it perfect and linear, and are we where we want to be? Of course not, right? And this is like a process. And my lifetime is 100 years, let's say, and in 300 years, they'll be further along. I'll be gone, whatever. But I, during my window, I want to have advanced according to what I regard as sort of Enlightenment principles, which is, you try to expand the well-being of as many people, right, as you can, both in terms of material wealth, but also like rights and privileges. And so, now there is no country where slavery is technically legal. I mean, there are places where there are slaves, but 200 years ago, most countries, it was just legal and it was just like part of doing business. And 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, I mean, Rome was a slave country. I mean, when Genghis Khan captured the village, you were a slave, and so that's the way the world went, right? Basically every single country that did. And so, but now we at least express the opinion that is wrong, and that's progress, Are we perfect? Obviously not, but there are trajectories. And so I do feel like there has been this change where I think things were cyclical for 7,000 years. And then now there is this general trajectory of progress. And obviously there are ups and downs along the way. I would regard, in my opinion, the U.S. From 2016 to 2020 was on this little jag down, right? Because it was kind of a response to progress, right? But then in the aggregate, take any 50-year window. Things are almost always better at the end of the 50-year window than they were at the beginning. And, like the United States, 50 years ago, segregation was legal in the entire South. Totally legal. That was the way it was done. Now it's not. So are things perfect? Do we have equality? No, but the needle has moved, 100 years ago, the Indian subcontinent was controlled by the British. It's not now, there is self-determination there. Is it perfect in all those countries? No. I mean, right. I mean, I don't know all the details of Indian politics. I track it loosely. And sometimes people seem more authoritarian or religious than others. But clearly, having the people to have a vote, that matters. That is progress, everyone acknowledges. If you were in any country in the world, you just showed up and said, we are no longer a democracy, even if it's not really a democracy like Russia, you can't even say you're not going to be democratic. Like, at least people go through the motions because they acknowledge it. So you look at the most authoritarian countries like Democratic Republic of Korea, like that's not a democratic country, but they acknowledge the idea at least, North Korea, totally oppressive, but they're aware that this idea is out there, that people should have rights, even if they are not going to give them to you, And so you see what I mean? Like, I do think there is progress, imperfect though it is, and you just have to take, when you talked about scale, I think you have to take the appropriate window. I know lots of people, every single time the U.S. Senate, like the U.S. House of Representatives, it became majority Republican in 2022, after the 2022 election, 2023. And people are like yanking their hair out, right? But this is just, you're looking too narrowly at things, yes, we do have to push. I'm not saying you don't push and you don't struggle, right? But when you are measuring success, you can't look at it minute to minute or year to year or whatever, because you will pull your hair out, you will go crazy. But if you look at it in 50-year cycles or 100-year cycles or whatever, you will see that now, things are, I think, getting better. I'm willing to be proved wrong, but when I look at the various metrics that I can get access to, they've outlawed female circumcision in most African countries. I think that's progress, female education is up across Africa, right? Dramatically, that's way more than it was 50 years ago. That's progress. So I don't know. I mean, that's why I'm not a total cynic about the whole thing. Like, yes, there's no purpose, but things do seem to be getting better. It's just, we just have to recognize that our lives are not like the end of a long chain. We're in the middle of the chain. Like, we are not at the end of something. And that's what people have trouble with, because they figure when they die, it's over. And that's when you count your poker chips, right? But that's not. We're just like we're in this little window of this thing that's this long. And, we say, oh, history, 7,000 years of recorded history, that's all behind us. And we're at sort of the end, technological, whatever. No, it's going to keep going for another 7,000 years. And we're just in the middle, right? And you just have to frame it that way, in my opinion.
All right, so that's the end of another podcast episode. I hope you guys enjoyed this as much as I enjoyed putting it together. If you want to support the work that I'm doing, then consider becoming a Patreon member or a YouTube member via the links in the description below. Otherwise than that, I just want to say thank you for making it this far to the end. And a quick shout out to our Patreon members: Sean Singh, Rajvinder Kaur, Gurpreet Danjal, Gagan Singh, Yasmin Jazwa, Ramneek Gaur, Rav Singh, Ramneek Gaur, Anish Man, Gurdeep Bhatt, Gurpreet Singh, and Jazz Dillon. Also, a quick shout out to our YouTube members: Rav Singh, V, Jazz Dillon, Ravi Singh, Simi Sandhu, A Little History of the Sikhs, Wushu Man, Dadaji Kaur, G Singh, Gary Parmar, and N Singh. Otherwise than that, thank you for tuning in. Hopefully I'll see you in the next podcast episode. Bye.